So I will start off the webinar at this point. Right, so thank you very much for joining us. This is a first joint webinar from WTS Hansuke and from Dhruva Consultants, and we are going to be talking about data and analytics in the tax function. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. This is my gentle cue to Bilal to move to the next slide. Nice. So we are just going to go through with some initial introductions. Who am I? Who is Bilal? Who are WTS? And then we'll move on to talk about data and analytics in tax. We'll have a look at what some of the operational opportunities and risks will look like, what's happening on a day-to-day basis, where can you get those tactical advantages, those quick wins. Then we'll move on to think more strategically about how data and analytics can be part of your longer term thinking and how it can add value. And then we'll take your questions at the end. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next 57.5 minutes. So let's get on with some introductions.
Okay, so first of all, lovely to speak to you all. And Graham, thanks for having me. My name is Bilal Mansour, and I lead the tax technology, analytics, and transformation practice here at Dhruva Consultants. And that reflects my background, which is a mix of technology, data, and also accounting, finance, and tax as well. And interestingly, I've also had the privilege of, over my 20 years of working, having worked with Graham in some capacity over the course of all 20 years of that as well. So over to you, Graham.
So my name is Graham Tilbury. I'm a partner here in the UK at WTS Hansuke. I head up our digital practice. Like Bilal, I started out working in tax and technology, and that's broadened over the years to cover the full range of transformation, all the way from governance and process at one end through data and automation to technology at the other. I've been doing it, unfortunately, for 10 years more than Bilal, so he will say I have more knowledge. I know he really means I'm just a lot older. I'm a chartered tax advisor. I've worked at the Big Four. I've worked in-house at large multinationals. I've worked at tax software vendors. I frankly enjoy what I do. I like looking at people's issues and helping them to solve them, whether that's through changes of process, changes of data, changes of solutions and technology. So that's why I thoroughly enjoy these kinds of webinars, a chance to engage with a frankly very nice looking audience today, and to talk about things that are close to my heart and to Bilal's. So that's who Bilal and I are. Just briefly a little bit about who WTS are as well. So WTS Global is the largest tax advisory network that is independent. You may have heard of some other outfits, Deloitte, PW, KPMG, EY. I suspect between Bilal and myself, we've worked at all of them over the years, but they are audit tied. They don't have full independence in what they can do, because if they are providing audit services to your organization, they won't be able to provide tax or digital services. So that's one of the key features about WTS Global. It's a new tax network. It's only been around for a couple of decades, launched in Germany back at the turn of the millennium, and is currently in more than 100 countries, offering a full portfolio of tax services, as well as advisory, compliance and technology solutions, with a huge digital hub. Actually, there's more than 300 people in Germany alone, so a very big tax technology organization. I've pulled a few example names of local agencies, local member firms. If you have a quick look at that list, I'm sure you'll be able to spot both Dhruva and WTS Hansuke. there's a range of different brand names there from across Europe and the wider world. And I'm happy to say I've worked with people from most of those particular firms already. And I know that there are partners all around the world that I can trust and rely on if we need to make use of that international network. Obviously, that's just a handful. We do have another slide which shows our full global coverage at any one time. This does continue to grow and to expand. I've been working with some colleagues in Australia for the last 9 months, and they were an associate member of the WTS network up until recently. They've just fully rebranded to WTS Australia, and they are becoming an expanded member within our global coverage. So you can see very serious global tax practice, and both Hansuke and Dhruva are full member firms of that global tax network. So that's who we are, Bilal, myself, and WTS. So I guess that's the introductions over and done with. Probably should start getting on with the webinar by now. So today's session is about data and analytics in the tax function. So Bilal, we'd better start off by telling people what we mean by data and analytics.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll do is start with just a bit of framing. And what I've used is a very famous framework, the Data Information Knowledge Wisdom Framework. And I'm using this because I think it's just a simple way of showcasing all the different things that we talk about across that spectrum. So I think, first of all, I'm sure many of you have already seen this before, but what I want to draw out from this in particular is the relationships between the different things. So a few principles as we get started. So as you move up this pyramid, data, information, knowledge, wisdom, what you see is an increase in organizational value of the artifacts, the things at each level. And that's because what we see is the activities and the focus move. So what it does is it moves from, what things are and where they're stored and how they're organized, all the way to start asking more interesting questions as to what has actually happened, why has something happened, and then finally to understanding what we should do. So that's the synthesis or the product of all of this information and all of this all of the things that come out from each step. And the other thing I want to briefly touch on, because this is something which I will come back to, is what happens at each step. How does data go from information to knowledge to wisdom? And that activity I'll touch on now. So first of all, there's a lot of processing, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the work that goes from taking those observations, those data facts, producing information, all that processing work that goes on. And then from taking what we call information, using that to be able to have some meaningful understanding, that's the cognitive work. That's the work that's typically done by people in understanding exactly what's going on, producing, whatever it is. And then the final thing, the wisdom, that's the judgment. That's the thing which comes from experience. And that's the part at the very top end, which allows us to be able to make those decisions. So that's the theory, as it were. What I'd like to do is now ask Graham to make that real in the context of tax.
Thanks, Bilal. So obviously, there is a huge issue of the use of data in tax departments. And from what I see with clients, the issue is how you try and keep everything tied together. Business owns the source data. ERPs are set up to run for how a business needs to operate. It's the business. Regulators and tax authorities, they own compliance and reporting. They set those requirements, they set those formats. And what typically happens is tax is sat in the middle with people pulling in different directions. And what it has to do is somehow tie together the data it's got with the requirements it's being asked to deal with, whilst both ends are moving all of the time. So frankly, it's a thankless task. It's something that's really hard to bake into traditional software, and is why a lot of tax and accounts people use Excel an awful lot, because it's the only way they can control the data and control their processes. So what I see in terms of data and analytics currently is a lot of activity in the data and information areas of the pyramid, a lot of work in Excel, which is being upgraded by bigger organizations to the low code environment. We're seeing the use of data wrangling and data analytics tools, the likes of Alteryx, the likes of Power Automate, and they are using those to increase efficiency and to reduce risk. Up at the analysis part of the pyramid, we see two different focuses, I would say. There's an insight focus, and so I'm seeing a lot of need for dashboarding, predominantly around more regular processes. So we see this in indirect taxes much more than we see it in corporate taxes, and that's to allow country managers or regional managers to be able to try and do that analytics code to code, month to month, quarter to quarter, and generate insights. But also I'm seeing it more with data quality. If you can pull together a dashboard of all the indirect tax rates in your underlying data, you can start asking questions when you start seeing a VAT rate on a transaction of 9.17% and go, I'm pretty sure that's not a VAT rate I recognize. And you can then start drilling back into that source data. So I think that's where I see a difference at the data level, the information level, and the knowledge level. Wisdom, maybe not yet. So that sets the scene. What we probably should do is look at the detail now. And so we'll start thinking about some of the day-to-day changes that could be made in your tax functions right now with existing tools, and trying to pick off some of those low-hanging fruits. So Bilal, over to you. Can you tell our audience about some of the data and analytics opportunities you're seeing in tax?
Yes, certainly. So what I'll start with is something which, whether it was in 2004 when I first started my career, or even today, tax often finds itself a little bit lonely when it comes to how it fits into the organizational infrastructure. And what we find is that that's driven by a couple of things. So one of the big things which kind of drive this need for tax to figure things out for itself is that tax processes are often more challenging than maybe some other parts of the organization to systematize. And that's driven by things like, for example, the laws being relatively complex, laws changing so often. You could have, once a year, every half a year, things suddenly change which affect the organization, affect the tax function. Country-wise, each country has its own rules, each country has its own requirements. And then often on top of that, what you have is a big judgmental element, what we were talking about earlier. All of that makes tax a difficult thing to systematize, and therefore what ends up happening is tax often has to kind of think about how it solves its own problems. Graham, I know you had some thoughts on this as well that you wanted to expand on.
Absolutely, because this is exactly why I've had the career that I've had. You do have these real difficulties where there's a limited understanding of what each other gets up to. Tax has always looked at IT as being kind of diametrically opposite to an accountant, and they just happily wash their hands and go, no, I don't understand IT. I'll leave it to them, they're the experts. And you get exactly the same the other way around. The IT people going, well, of course I don't know anything about tax. They'll have to do it, leave it to them. And so you get this silo mentality either being built or reinforced. And what then happens is it just leads to blame. Projects don't happen, IT and tax don't coordinate, and there's just a whole load of pointing of fingers at the end going, well, we knew what we were doing, it's their fault, they didn't understand us. And certainly the first probably 15 or 20 years of my career, people looked at me in the same way they looked at somebody who was, able to speak Russian as well as English. I was considered to be some sort of translator almost, because the IT people just couldn't get the tax people and vice versa. And tax people wouldn't ask IT people to do something because they assumed it was impossible, whereas actually that was the easy bit of the engagement from the IT side of it. The problem is some tax advisors, they've taken this and they've tried to make a virtue out of it. And they love going to tax people and saying, but you're special. Of course you need something different for how you work. And that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you end up just with those silos. Of course, tax ends up washing its hands, going it alone, and you either end up with 1,000,001 Excel spreadsheets or some little cottage industries, which, whilst they have short-term appeal, they have a lot of issues, a lot of risks, and a lot of governance to be dealt with. So this tax in isolation is a real problem. But I think at least if we can acknowledge it and move beyond the sad eyes, then we can still do some great things together. So, Bilal, we've acknowledged it. Let's see what we can do for picking up some of this operational stuff.
Brilliant. Okay. Excuse me. So what I'm going to start with is a couple of opportunities and where they're located on the pyramid. So coming back to our framework, the DIKW framework, one of the biggest areas where we see opportunities to apply data analytics techniques is just in simple data processing. One of the big things, and I'll come on to this in more detail a little bit later, is just data cleaning. And so in that kind of universe, things like, for example, is this the right length? Is this a date? Let's split this thing up. Let's take this data and blend it with this one to get a complete view of something. All those things are repetitive and they require very little judgment. So they're things which you can say, okay, well, those are ideal things to be able to be automated. So I think that's a classic case where something like an ETL tool, and we've got some examples here, can add value. And this is something which we've seen, as far as our experience goes, many organizations begin that journey of adopting and saying, okay, well, what can we do with these to take away some of that churn? Alongside this, what we see is another big area, and that's just around being able to do things like provide some oversight through the use of BI technologies. And a classic example of where we see this is in providing operational oversight. Where are we with various deadlines? Where are we with various liabilities and payments, etc., and providing some BI oversight over that, taking data from various different places and putting a what I would call a cognitive layer on top of that, saying, okay, well, we're going to help you to understand all of this. So all these things, super valuable, and not to give the game away, but what I'm going to do is we're going to come up with some very challenging considerations around this. But before we do that, just some thoughts on this, Graham.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that this isn't a huge surprise for our audience. I expect a lot of them are quite familiar with these types of tools, these types of reports. We don't need to elaborate a lot at this stage, but they do drive a lot of value and you can implement them really quickly. And that helps tax as an independent function to get going. there's a lot of approaches you can take, lots of different tools on the market. Your current advisors, all of your other advisors who are trying to get on the phone to you, they will all have opinions, they will all have favorites. So there's plenty of ways you can build capabilities within your team. What you won't have initially is the experience. And having somebody like Bilal on the end of the phone who you can just say, what are the problems with this? Has this worked out before? I think that's the real value that advisors should be bringing to you. It's not saying this is the tool you should use, it's telling you what do you need to look out for. In my experience, a lot of tax teams are run very lean. They don't have the spare time to look at a project, to implement a process. They're busy running to stand still, and somebody's already decided to do the whole do more with less mantra, trying to put more tasks in. So if you can take some of these fairly familiar looking processes and build some quick wins, actually what that does is it demonstrates very tangibly that you can crystallize some savings, whether that's in time or cost, and that then allows you to start reinvesting them into the next project, and you can build your way up incrementally into some of those bigger and more rewarding transformations. So don't dismiss the small stuff. It really is a helpful way to get going.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a key thing I want to build on in this next part as well, because what we see is great, these things do have this built-in value associated with them, but there's also a lot of risks that are associated with this. And I want to cover two or three of the most common ones we see. And I'll start with this one, which is poor ROI. So a lot of these tools are expensive. There's no way of getting around it. And one of the most common challenges we see is the way they're used. They're used for things which are relatively low value in terms of complexity. You know, you might be paying thousands of dollars for something, which is just basic cleansing. And quite often there's a cost associated with not just the licensing. You know, you got all the things around it, the training, the maintaining, all the kind of governance around it. And so you might have this challenge of, well, what's the value as an organization that we're getting from this? And the risk fundamentally there comes down to, does this continue to next year? Do you end up at square one? Why this happens? I think there's a shiny new toy type of mindset that sometimes comes in. Oh, look, everybody's talking about this thing. Let's give it a go. People, jump in, which is great, that enthusiasm. But there isn't the pipeline of use cases and opportunities and value measure associated with it. And so what you end up doing is you end up taking a very expensive tool and a very expensive investment in all the things around it to drive that. The other challenge I see is around what we call halfway digitization. And this is basically saying, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to automate a section of the process, and again, I'm going to be a little bit challenging here, we're going to automate a bad process. And I think that's a big risk. And the way you might see this is you might have manual steps before and after the automation, lots of things which are being done to get things right for that automation. And this, in some ways, undermines the purpose of doing that particular exercise in, wherever it is, in cleaning the data, in being able to automate some testing, wherever it is. Because what happens is you introduce risk before or after that process. So quite often, one of the things which we see is the lack of integration into the overall process, lack of designing what that new process could look like. What we also sometimes see is some challenges in saying, okay, well, Have you thought about where this data can come from? Do you even have access to it? Have you communicated what you're doing with this data? So all these types of things can cause it. The final thing which I see as far as a cause of this halfway digitization is actually just around people's capabilities. And so it's great to start small as far as your digitization goes, but quite often what we also see alongside that is being built in a way that makes it very difficult to integrate up and down. So that's one of the big challenges that we see as far as digitization goes. So Graham, I think you had some comments just around the last point as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, you do have issues in terms of when you get started. I think a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of risks, they're risks that we have to be aware of, but risks we have to accept whilst we're getting going, and we're kind of iteratively going through some of the more tactical solutions and generating the capacity to think more strategically. And there will be answers from more of a strategic perspective to all of these issues as we go on through the webinar today. But certainly in that short term, you do tend to have individuals that go forwards, and people will be building those tools as a kind of a little cottage industry, each person responsible for their own area. And so they'll be processing their data, they'll be generating something from it without looking to the whole team, the whole enterprise. Is that data being used for a different process within tax, or in tax outside of your company, or in finance, or in the business in general? So you might be picking up entertainment expenditure because that's an add back in your corporate tax calculation, but it could be really valuable to the business itself if they could pick up that piece of information and track it. We see this across all of the piece within tax. You've got this duplication of effort. You're doing something to the data and somebody else is. I'm actually been doing a piece of client review work for their processes to do some automation for them. And I found the same base reports in Excel that are being used in 7 different monthly processes, and they've got different people doing 98% of the same manipulations to that base data as part of their monthly process. And obviously, if you can coordinate that, you are going to save even more time and risk than just looking at it in isolation. So duplication of effort, lack of ownership, they are risks. It needs a different system to control them, but we still need to go through this first set of iterations and just be mindful of how we manage that risk and know that we can effectively lock in even more savings going forward.
Great point. Yeah, and I think that that those themes that you talked about around reuse and how to align these things are things which we're going to keep revisiting as we proceed as well. So one of the things I want to talk about, because I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, is talk about how we can address some of these challenges. And so, for example, I mean, there's lots of different things which are very great interventions around this. Graham and I have picked on 2 particular that we see as being like the most common interventions, the most common pieces of advice that we give to our clients. So the first one is champions. Champions creates ownership. It creates a opportunity to invest deeply in expertise, and it also provides a single point of contact for the organization. So, for example, being able to say, okay, well, what are all the different use cases? All this data, where is it coming from? Where does it come from? Where does it go? Like this idea of coordinating, for example, with enterprise data. What does good look like? What does quality look like? Having a champion or champions for different areas is a very successful model, and it's very much in line with current thinking around best practice more broadly for enterprise data. The idea of having federated data owners in different parts of the business, because those central teams don't have the domain expertise to be able to drive the use cases, to be able to find, what good looks like, all that kind of stuff. So our kind of big piece of advice just around how to approach this is it's very much like a process or a person type intervention, which is have somebody who can be the advocate for the voice for this transformation.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So I think the other challenge is to be almost an intelligent buyer. And it's difficult when you're sat there as the tax person and you've got an advisor coming in and they're promising the moon on a stick. They've got the most groundbreaking technology. It's all seamless. It's all automated. You're in a fast changing landscape. You need to take something that's going to solve all of these problems. It's a magic bullet. And yes, there are a lot of new technologies out there. They do hold significant value, but you have to be able to challenge. You have to be able to go back and ask the awkward questions. What is the TCOA? What is the governance model? You have to be happy that you can see beyond that first build what is going to be the impact over the lifetime of that solution. Does it cause more problems than it solves long term? And we often see technology projects which get implemented and fail within a year because they can't be maintained. It doesn't get embedded properly, or there are hidden costs that you hadn't realized. I think a clear example of this was kind of the first wave of AI solutions being pushed out by the big firms. 5-6 years ago, there were a lot of magic wand salespeople out there saying that they had AI that was going to solve everything from categorizing tax to finding clients to saving internal costs. And all of them came with a lot of promises. And then after the contract had been signed, I saw a lot of multinationals suddenly being told that it was their responsibility to clean up their training data. And actually, you suddenly found there was a year's worth of internal cost effort that hadn't been made transparent. And somebody was trying to convince you that it was your fault you hadn't realized this. So challenge is absolutely essential. Don't be afraid to ask the awkward questions, because if it sounds too good to be true, it almost certainly is going to be too good to be true. So make sure you're looking at what that process will look like now, 6 months' time, in 18 months' time, in 5 years' time, and ask those awkward questions, because otherwise you will be a very unhappy buyer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, challenging being an intelligent buyer, great themes, and I think as you say, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That point that you made about how quality of data ties into what you can do up the chain is something which we'll build on in a couple of moments. In fact, my next slide is literally about that. I am conscious of time, so what I'll do is I'll kind of provide you with some high-level themes that we can kind of build on as we go through. So for example, there's tons on this slide, but what I want to do is just very briefly talk about data cleansing, because that's one of those key data processing activities that happens. I'm sure everybody's heard of this, which is that 70% of a data scientist's time is spent just on data wrangling, getting the data in the right format, getting this piece of data, getting that piece of data, making sure that it all makes sense and is consistent, or et cetera, et cetera. And that's absolutely true of tax departments as well. So that 70% of time is often very repeatable. And that's where we see a huge opportunity for us to be able to do stuff around automation, around data quality, and getting that working really well. So a lot on the slide again. My biggest recommendation from all of this is just to start small. There's lots of decisions to make as whether or not, and by the way, throughout this whole deck, there's a lot of opinions in here as well. Like, for example, do you take something out of the box or do you take something custom? Do look through that. But my biggest takeaway from all of this is start small. Take something that you are doing repetitively, and your ideal use case is something which has lots and lots of volume, lots and lots of rows, lots and lots of manual processes, but not a lot of cognitive effort. So find a nice use case, put it in place. What you'll find is that not only will you prove the technology part, but the bits which you are quite often the risky parts, which are the process parts, you can start to iron those out. Where do we get this data from? Can we get this in a more reliable way? Can we get this in a more systematized way so that there are fewer touch points? Who's taking this data? What's being consumed? So I think that would be my key message just around using some of these automation tools for data cleansing. Graham, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, hugely important, as you say, Bilal, that you can start small and improve incrementally. You don't have to do it all in a big bang. But I think the problem that I see is that people get lured by the shininess, and they continue to chase new improvements to data quality, but they're not embedding the initial wins. And so actually the controls element here is hugely important. Otherwise, you risk the technology focus overriding the governance focus. So when you're doing that data quality improvement, make sure that you've got a process in place, that someone will go and update the standard operating procedures for the people that were providing the data to embed that new item of data processing so that you don't keep having the same data quality issue. Make sure you update your tax control framework to make sure that you've got that control on taxes list and that they can go and make sure it's still being followed. You've got CFOs in a number of territories that have process-driven audit rules, places like the UK senior accounting officer regime, where you're going to have to make sure this is embedded or you can't sign off on your processes. So it's important all the way from your tax audit with the regulator through to just keeping your cost savings locked in. So make sure those controls are in place.
Wonderful. Yeah, and just kind of building on what you were saying about, making sure that those controls are in place. Another big area, kind of slightly more upstream, that we see opportunities for automation is in calculations. And so this is a very ripe area, and there's lots of things that can facilitate this. In fact, one of the things which the eagle-eyed of you may have noticed is that in our kind of advice around out of the box versus custom, where when we're talking about data cleansing, we're probably talking about, take something which is generic. Here, our biggest kind of piece of advice is find something that has as much out of the box content as possible, because that's a huge maintenance burden for organizations. And we see all the time, like, for example, in the UAE now, corporate tax is just being introduced. And many organizations are saying, hey, let's build this on our ERP systems. Let's build this, in our BI systems. And the conversation we have is, it's certainly possible, but there's a whole spectrum of things to consider beyond, do I get the right answer? Are my audit controls going to be up to scratch? What happens when the law changes? All these types of things. And those can massively affect the success, the maintainability, the ROI, the cost. So those are some really important things I'd kind of want to draw out just around calculation automation.
Absolutely. And I think from the control side of it, whilst you do have the ability sometimes to kind of almost outsource some of that risk to the software vendor, you still can't absolve yourself of it entirely. You're still the taxpayer. It's still your responsibility that those calculations and subsequently the filings, they are your responsibility. And I have seen not only inadvertent mistakes, I've seen more insidiously deliberate mistakes with filings in a couple of organizations. And that's even harder to spot if you don't have the right controls in place. I know it can be quite difficult because it looks like you're not trusting your staff. But actually, if you work with an external advisor and you can frame this as being best practice, actually putting in the right controls to revalidate, has it been filed? Has it been correctly tagged in an automated territory? These things do become really important, and they can create a lot of problems if they're not dealt with appropriately. So yeah, even in that built and outsourced sense, you still have to take great care from a governance perspective.
Yeah, yeah, and when we come to looking at what those controls do, one of the things which they often are is they're mechanisms by which you're performing reviews and you're checking things, and this is another area that's absolutely ripe for operational efficiencies in tax, because especially when you're looking at your quick wins, things which are high volume, low complexity checks, you have this opportunity to move from sample-based testing, where you say, okay, well, let's check if this is right, let's check if this thing's right, and then, extrapolate as to whether or not everything is correct, to saying, okay, well, with the right tooling and the right processes, you can actually do full population tests. You can see if the whole data set for that particular period and is correct. You can say, okay, well, has the right rate been applied? Is there any kind of oddities? And this is especially true when you're talking about transactional data, things like VAT, where you can go into very specific granular levels. You're dealing with high volumes. And also you have this opportunity to, you have like masses and masses of patterns that you can observe as well. So this is a very ripe area.
I think, Bilal, we probably need to canter a bit more quickly towards some of the strategic stuff, just with an eye on how quickly the clock's winding down.
Got it. Okay. So very briefly, then I'll just touch on a couple of things before we move on to this, because we do want to just cover a couple of points around the operational. One is that beyond what we've talked about, those 3 or 4, use cases around processing, there are some really interesting emerging use cases, which, and for those who are playing at home, when we're talking about information to knowledge, we're talking about cognitive support and cognitive automation. There's a lot of stuff in the AI space which is emerging as very interesting to be able to support this. From an operational perspective, things like, for example, saying, hey, what, does this rate look right? Is this odd? Is this matching what's in the invoice? There's tons of opportunities that are emerging in this space, and it's something which, when I come to talk about some of the strategic things, we'll touch on how we facilitate and enable this as well.
Excellent. So strategic. Obviously, operational is important. The tactical is hugely important, but we do need to at least look ahead from those simple, quick wins to strategically, how do we grasp the nettle? How do we start embedding some real, genuine transformation and locking in some very good process change that will give you risk handled, give you operational efficiencies, moving just beyond that day-to-day data and analytics. So, Bilal, again, if you want to just tee this up.
Yeah, wonderful. Absolutely. And by the way, I'm going to talk a little bit faster. So if you haven't taken your Ritalin, now's a good time to do so. But the game here is operational. I need to prepare my tax return. How can I do that as efficient as possible? Great. But there's a whole universe of strategic things that tax functions do. And where we're now in terms of what's possible, means that operational or using DNA in operations isn't enough. You're not making the most of the opportunity. And in particular, if we look at some of those, recommendations around, having champions and, challenging your vendors, all this kind of stuff, that'd be great. But I think there's something to be said about the broader value. Very briefly, it's driven by two big things. Obviously, pace of decision making organizationally is massively increasing, but also what we're seeing is the types of data that tax functions are having to work with is extremely fast. It's much more voluminous in terms of how much you're producing. There's different types of artifacts being produced. All those types of things mean that actually there's a lot of strategic decisions that need to be made as well. And what we don't want to do is have a situation in which tax functions effectively act as decision-making bottlenecks or execution bottlenecks here as well. So what we'll now do is touch on some of those things in a little bit more detail. So what I'm going to do is first, I'm just going to start with one of the things which you'll probably come across, which is data warehousing. So data warehousing, as far as what it is, so actually before we get into detail, this is something which 100% every single person has heard of: data warehouses, data lakes, databases, data puddles, data oceans, whatever it is, right? I don't want to give you the impression that this is something complicated. What I'm talking about here is having a place where your tax data is organized for you to use is all we mean. And so that could be a warehouse, that could be something else. We don't necessarily need it to mean anything else. And coming back to my soapbox, one of the things I will say is that a lot of people will try and sell you this idea of you need a tax data warehouse. That comes with its challenges and that comes with its benefits. Pros and cons, very briefly, you have something out of the box which you can plug into, but quite often what we see is you're kind of forced into a particular schema, like a particular person's worldview of what tax concepts look like. And there's going to be an awful lot of stuff that doesn't really fit. Especially with modern architectures and modern approaches, the way you kind of want to think about tax data warehousing is, can this live somewhere where it's accessible? Can I put standardization on things which are able to be organized in a standard way? And can the rest of it live in a way that's unstructured? Those are your kind of big things that you need to do. Beyond that, absolutely, warehousing is great. It's massively valuable, but it is something which, your enterprise data team will be able to support you on. But I think my big steer here is just keep it simple in terms of what you need. So Graham, you had a lot of thoughts here, I remember, just on how this works from a cultural perspective as well.
Absolutely, and this comes back to the whole, you can implement a technology project perfectly and it will still fail if people don't want to use it. The whole culture and training aspect of data warehousing is immensely important because you need to have it in use. Yeah, no one knows your business better than you. So I think, as Bilal says, it's not about taking somebody else's schema and not their worldview. You know better than your advisor how data should be structured. That's not the issue. The issue is getting the data into a data warehouse, and that requires people to buy into it, and that buy-in comes from culture and training. If you're sat in the tax department at head office and you've got a dozen people sat around you, making them put their source data into the data warehouse, you can micromanage that if you have to. But if your tax data from around the world is coming from an army of financial controllers who have a part-time responsibility for tax, and they could be 5, 10, 15,000 kilometers away from head office, then are they going to put everything in that you want? Can you get the full picture? I worked with one firm that was putting in a data lake, and I said, I bet the problem is people won't put it in. And one of the head office tax directors immediately went, well, actually, you are right. What we really want is the data that goes into this form that we used to have. But enterprise data said they didn't have enough storage capability to capture that level. And so they're just asking for the summary information. And we know the data we're actually interested in is on the old form, on the old spreadsheet, and that's still on everybody's hard drives, and that's not going into the data warehouse. So you've got to actually take that ownership, make sure you're capturing the data you need, and you need to be able to train the people that are providing that data all across your organization, not just in the technology, but in the new process, in why the process has changed, what's its purpose, what's the reason, convincing them that it's actually in their interest to do this. If you don't praise your adopters when they engage, if you don't share the importance, if you don't share your appreciation, if you don't continue to reinforce that, people will stop using it. They'll revert to the old type, and you won't have the data you need, and you'll just have a very expensive, half-empty data warehouse.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I mean, I love the themes that you're describing. That, you know, the what of the data warehouses can be a little bit of a, you know, a much of a muchness, but as far as what those processes around it are, what the support around it are, and how people are using it, that's where the value is.
You can't ignore the people when you're talking about process and technology, and people ignore other people and their opinions at their peril, because fundamentally, unless you've sacked 100% of your workforce and you've created some fully digitalized virtual organization, then you only function if your people are bought in. And that is the biggest overlooked part of every technology project that's ever happened.
That's very true. Now, speaking of very sophisticated approaches, one of the things which I will touch on is just around what that oversight around automation can look like as well. There's an awful lot, once again on this slide, but I think the big themes I wanted to draw out here, one of them is just around, you know, we were talking about challenging the vendor. A lot of these automation platforms, they don't necessarily have governance built in. And so making sure you choose well is crucial, because quite often what you could end up with in a situation is you're buying something which creates a problem, and then your vendor is then selling you another thing to solve that problem. Which, who wants that, right?
Yeah.
So having lots of, for example, desktop automations all over the shop, versus something which you can kind of observe what's going on, where data's coming from, where it's going to. Those choices coming into your, being an intelligent buyer are super critical. The other part of it, I think, which is really worth drawing out, is just around the way in which data is used. Sorry, data is produced. So you've got this thing of producing the automations. There's an artifact at the end of it. And so what happens in that? And so there's a whole discipline around how do you catalog that? How do you make sure that everybody understands what that product is? Because that's, once again, it's going to be massively useful for somebody else to consume that. And we're talking not just within tax, but beyond tax as well. And I'll kind of come on to that a little bit more later.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, audit independence. Tax advisors sell products and services, but they can be withdrawn next week because an audit partner somewhere else in the world wants to win a local audit for your global company. It's such a fragile ecosystem, and that's just when you look at it from an advisory perspective in tax. When you look at technology, it's obvious the whole system is untenable if you don't have audit independence. And a lot of the oversight issues that I see are because clients have started down this road, they've done a few years, and then they've had to change advisor, and so they've got lots of different groupings because of that steady rotation of audit firm, and that creates excessive governance costs compared to a best practice approach to this. But I know we're down to the last 5 minutes, so we'll talk quickly and I'll say less.
So very briefly, I did mention earlier some examples of some of the things which are emerging. One of the things, and again, if you're playing at home, you might want to try and guess this, but that kind of work in synthesizing wisdom from knowledge, the judgmental stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's emerging to help with that. There's a whole thought around how that works, like human in the loop and making sure that it's there to support rather than decide. But there is a lot of capabilities that are emerging in this space. So, for example, I work at Dhruva. There's a lot of work we're doing internally to drive that. Graham at Hansuke. There's pools of knowledge and pools of information which can be used to be able to drive better reasoning. And so that's one of the opportunities. And touching on there's a little bit at the end, which is all around data lifecycle management. I'll come on to that because I think that's going to be one of the critical areas for being able to move into extracting strategic value.
Absolutely. I mean, AI is clearly something which has had a huge impact across everybody's lives over the last 10 years. All I want to do is just remind you that AI is an enormously big umbrella term for a lot of different technologies. And what you really need to do is know which can be used in different situations. Frankly, anyone that comes along and says, I've got an AI solution, I'm always concerned that they're a less informed sales executive rather than somebody with a deep understanding of the underlying technologies, and they're just trying to make a sale with a buzzword. Tax is a rules-based system. Regulators challenge taxpayers when they use AI because they want to know how they have got to that position, how they got to that answer. If you're doing tax code selection by AI for your compliance, how can you demonstrate you've made the right coding decision? Because machine learning is a black box. If instead you take a slightly more thoughtful process, you could have an expert system that could be augmented by some cognitive linguistics and some natural language processing that could do the coding, but you can have the human in the loop. You can have your machine learning there, but you can have it to spot anomalies and to escalate those anomalies for professional review. That way, you can still get the benefits of AI, but you can 100% explain every decision you've made. And frankly, it's probably a lot cheaper than the big AI product that you were going to be sold in the first place. So understand what is being sold to you, that earlier point. If you're not sure what you're being told, firstly, that's a red flag. Secondly, phone Bilal up and ask him what they're really selling, because you can find your way through this, but it needs intelligent buying.
Brilliant. Yeah, some great thoughts there, and I think in particular just around the explainability, the limitations, etc. as well. Building on those, a couple more risks, and again, I'll be super brief, but privacy and security. I think everybody has kind of come across an article at some point, if they're not Google it to this week. We know how some of these language models are being trained. We know how a lot of different types of AI are being trained. It's in a very gray area. So one of the things which, as far as big recommendations go, is having an AI strategy, making sure that we, as an organization, you have the right guardrails as far as what you can use, how you can use it, all those types of considerations. Because otherwise, there may be what we call kind of the unknown unknowns, right? There might be something which comes back to you at some point which you have no idea is so far out your Johari window, you're like, what is that, right? So just a consideration there. A point around consistency. Data warehousing very much relies on being able to say, okay, well, we have all this data, let's label it in the right way, let's structure it in the right way, let's make it consistent. Hugely valuable. It is becoming less and less of a barrier because of the way in which modern technologies are able to kind of glean what things are associated with each other. But having consistent views of the different concepts, nonetheless, is massively important. It's going to help make, going all the way up and down that pyramid, it's going to make that seamless, make you able to use as much data as possible from that pyramid. And
one thing I'd like to add in is key person dependency. Seen it in spades in the last few years in tax departments, when RPA was being pushed by the big four, when the early low code was being pushed. Tax departments were being encouraged to train one person. And when that person got good, they just upsold themselves to another MNC because they'd acquired a whole load of new skills, and the department that they'd been in was in a worse position than they were before. Bilal mentioned early on that our professional institutes are really focusing on bringing these kinds of technology skills in as part of professional training. And I think that we need to be very aware of that and make sure that when we are looking at technologies and data and analytics, we're making the whole of our teams part of that process. We're upskilling all of them. You'll get the benefit that they will be happy, they will have been upskilled, but also you won't have those key person issues either. So that should give us what we need. Okay.
Wonderful. So I had a soapbox moment just around that very last point on the very bottom right of this slide, just around walled gardens. It is something which I'll just touch on. I know we're going a bit late, but one of the things which I really would recommend every buyer of technology to ask is, if you're buying tax software, is how do I get access to my data? Because if it's a black box, if it's a black hole, which is to say you put data in, but you can never get it out other than what they provide you, it's going to limit you what you can do with that and the value you can drive. So that's just one consideration there. All right, so we've got a couple of points. I think Graham's already touched on one of the key ones, which is just around training. It's easier than ever to leverage these technologies. And as Graham said, it's more and more important to make sure that there isn't that key person dependency on somebody, that champion who might build something and then go, and then you have no idea how it works. It's part of every professional program as an optional or even mandatory. So let's ensure we build that in. Challenging. Any thoughts, Graham, just around being a sophisticated buyer? You mentioned there's themes around data.
Absolutely. I think that it has to be entirely about your data, and whilst we need to make sure that we can start improving that incrementally and iteratively, it's about taking ownership as well as improving it and taking your whole team with you on that journey, because you will spend forever trying to fix your data if it isn't going in right at the source. And so it's about establishing that culture and taking that more strategic and governance-led approach. My apologies, I know we've already run slightly over on time. I think we will have to skip the last slide, and I think that Bilal and I will have to come back to you all individually to pick up any of the questions that you've provided during the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's been a really exciting session from my perspective. It's been great being able to have somebody as immense as Bilal here so that we can share and exchange views, and I hope you've all found it really helpful. Thank you so much for staying 5 minutes beyond the scheduled end time of the webinar. If you have any further questions, please do reach out and get in touch with us to follow up. And tell us if you enjoyed it, because I'm sure Bilal and I would be happy to do another session and maybe take a little bit more time over some of the points that we're discussing at that stage. Bilal.
Thank you all. Thank you, Graham, for having me on this. And yeah, really nice to have spent time with all of you. Yeah, we're here if you need us.
Brilliant. Well, until next time, thank you all so very much indeed. Okay, cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.